The Spanish-American War was a conflict between the United States and Spain that took place in 1898. The war was fought primarily in the Caribbean and the Pacific, with major battles occurring in Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. The conflict arose due to long-standing tensions between the two nations over Spain's colonial rule in these areas. Tensions were further heightened by the rise of American imperialism, which sought to expand U.S. influence beyond its borders. This expansionist sentiment was driven by several factors, including economic interests, strategic considerations, and a belief in the superiority of American culture and institutions. The immediate trigger for the war was the Cuban War of Independence, which began in 1895. The Cubans were seeking to end Spanish colonial rule and establish their own independent nation. In response to the uprising, Spain dispatched troops to Cuba to put down the rebellion. However, this led to a humanitarian crisis as the Spanish military employed brutal tactics against the Cuban people. News of these atrocities reached the United States and caused a public outcry, further fueling support for intervention in Cuba. On February 15, 1898, the USS Maine, an American warship, arrived in Havana, Cuba, to protect U.S. citizens and interests. However, on February 16th, the ship unexpectedly exploded and sank, resulting in the deaths of 266 American sailors. While the cause of the explosion is still debated, it quickly became a point of contention in American politics, with many calling for war with Spain. On April 25, 1898, Congress declared war on Spain and the Spanish-American War began. The first major engagement of the war occurred in the Philippines on May 1, 1898, when American forces under the command of Commodore George Dewey defeated the Spanish fleet in the Battle of Manila Bay. This victory gave the U.S. Navy control of the Philippines and opened the door for American troops to occupy the islands. Meanwhile, in Cuba, American ground forces began their campaign against the Spanish on June 24, 1898, with the Battle of Las Casimas. Despite being outnumbered, the Americans achieved a decisive victory, opening the way for their advance into the interior of the island. On July 3, 1898, American troops captured the Spanish port of Santiago de Cuba, effectively ending organized Spanish resistance in Cuba. The war in Cuba was essentially over by the end of July 1898. However, fighting continued in the Philippines until August, when Spanish forces surrendered. The Treaty of Paris, which officially ended the war, was signed on December 10, 1898. By the terms of the treaty, Spain ceded the island of Cuba, the island of Puerto Rico, and the island of Guam to the United States. Additionally, Spain also sold the Philippines to the United States for $20 million. The Spanish-American War had a profound impact on both the United States and Spain. For the United States, the war marked the emergence of a global power. Prior to 1898, the United States had limited foreign possessions and had largely remained isolated from international conflicts. However, the war with Spain transformed the United States into a major player on the world stage. The acquisition of new territories, such as Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam, expanded American influence and resources, providing new markets for trade and raw materials. It also gave the United States a strategic advantage in key regions around the globe. The war had a significant impact on the American economy. The acquisition of new territories brought vast amounts of wealth to the United States, opening up new markets for American goods and services. The influx of natural resources from these territories also fueled industrial growth and economic prosperity. Moreover, the war led to technological advancements as the United States invested in new weapons and communication systems. These innovations not only helped to secure American interests abroad, but also had civilian applications that contributed to the growth of various industries. For Spain, the loss of its colonies marked the end of a long and rich colonial history. Spain had been a global power for centuries, ruling vast territories in the Americas, Africa, and Asia. However, the war with the United States resulted in the rapid decline of Spain's colonial empire. The loss of Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam dealt a severe blow to Spain's economy, prestige, and influence. To make matters worse, the United States acquired former Spanish territories that were vital to Spain's economic interests. For example, the Philippines was a key source of agricultural products and raw materials for Spain, while Cuba was an important market for Spanish goods. The loss of these territories deprived Spain of valuable resources and markets, hindering its ability to compete on the global stage. Furthermore, the war exposed the weakness of the Spanish military and government. Spain had been unable to effectively defend its colonies against the United States, highlighting the inadequacy of its military infrastructure and defense capabilities. This, in turn, raised questions about the effectiveness of the Spanish government and its ability to protect its citizens and interests abroad. The Spanish-American War marked a turning point in world history. The outcome of the conflict had far-reaching consequences for both the United States and Spain, as well as the global balance of power. Here's a summary of why the war was so significant. First, the war demonstrated the emergence of the United States as a global power. Before 1898, the United States had been relatively isolated from world affairs, focusing primarily on its domestic issues. However, the war with Spain thrust the United States onto the international stage, establishing it as a major player in global politics. The acquisition of new territories and the defeat of a traditional European power showcased American strength and influence, signaling the shift in global dynamics. Second, the war resulted in the decline of the Spanish Empire. Spain had been a dominant colonial power for centuries, ruling vast territories across the globe. However, the war with the United States brought about the rapid demise of the Spanish colonial empire. The loss of Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam marked a significant setback for Spain, reducing its size and power considerably. This decline diminished Spain's economic, political, and military influence, relegating it to a second-rate power on the world stage. Third, the war had profound consequences for the relationship between the United States and Latin America. Prior to the war, the United States had largely pursued a policy of isolationism, avoiding involvement in the affairs of other nations, especially in Latin America. However, the war in Cuba and the subsequent occupation of the island demonstrated a shift in this policy. The United States intervention in Cuba and the decision to annex Puerto Rico and the Philippines signaled a growing interest in expanding American proselyt's influence in Latin America. This move would have lasting implications for the region, as the United States would continue to assert its dominance in Latin American affairs throughout the 20th century. Fourth, the war spurred the rise of American imperialism. American imperialism refers to the policy of extending American power and influence beyond its borders through diplomacy, economic control, and military force. The war with Spain provided the impetus for this shift, as the United States found itself in possession of new territories and colonies. This acquisition of overseas possessions reflected an aggressive foreign policy aimed at securing strategic advantages and economic interests globally. American imperialism would become a prominent feature of U.S. foreign policy in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. leading to further expansion and intervention in various parts of the world. Fifth, the war highlighted the changing nature of warfare. The Spanish-American War displayed characteristics of both traditional and modern warfare. While it involved large-scale military operations and traditional battle tactics, it also incorporated new technologies and strategies. The use of naval power, rapid transportation, and new weapons such as machine guns influenced the outcome of the war. This blend of traditional and modern elements foreshadowed the evolving nature of warfare in the 20th century, which would be characterized by new technologies and unconventional tactics. In conclusion, the Spanish-American War was a pivotal event in world history, marking a significant shift in global power dynamics. The war led to the emergence of the United States as a global power, the decline of the Spanish Empire, a new relationship between the United States and Latin America, the rise of American imperialism, and a changing nature of warfare. Understanding the causes, events, and consequences of the Spanish-American War is crucial for comprehending the trajectory of the 20th century and the lasting impact it had on the world we live in today. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe for more historical content. And as always, thank you for watching.